Welcome to our deep dive into the world of personality disorders. You've given us quite the challenge with this psychology textbook chapter,
Yeah.
but that's what we're here for, right?
Yes.
To unpack this complex topic and give you the most important takeaways.
Absolutely. We're going to explore everything from the different ways these disorders are categorized to what the latest research tells us, and of course we'll dive into those fascinating case studies the chapter highlights.
Yeah, this is one of those areas in psychology that's constantly evolving. So even if you think you're familiar with personality disorders, get ready for some new insights.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What exactly is a personality disorder? We all have our little quirks, but when do those quirks cross the line into something more serious?
That's a great question. The key here is understanding that a personality disorder is more than just being difficult or eccentric.
Right.
It's about personality traits becoming so rigid and inflexible that they cause significant distress or impairment in a person's life.
So it's not like feeling down for a few weeks. It's something more pervasive.
Exactly. Think of it as a persistent pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that deviates significantly from what's considered normal in a person's culture.
Okay.
And importantly, these patterns are chronic.
Yeah.
They often start in childhood and can impact every aspect of a person's life. Their relationships, their work, their sense of self.
The chapter mentions that people with personality disorders often don't see it as a problem. That seems like a huge hurdle, right?
It absolutely can be.
Mhm.
There's often a lack of insight where the person doesn't recognize their behavior as being problematic. They might even blame others for the difficulties they experience. It's often the people around them, their loved ones, colleagues, who really bear the brunt of the disorder.
That makes sense. So how do we even begin to classify these disorders? The chapter talks about this big debate between using categories versus viewing them on a spectrum. Can you shed some light on that?
You've hit on one of the most hotly debated topics in the field. Think of it like this. Are personality disorders like distinct species, each with its own unique set of characteristics? Or are they more like points on a spectrum with everyone falling somewhere along that continuum?
Right, like is it black and white or are there shades of gray?
Exactly. Currently, the DSM-5, which is the manual used to diagnose mental health disorders, still uses a categorical approach.
Okay.
It lists 10 specific personality disorders grouped into 3 clusters, A, B, and C.
But even within the DSM-5, there's this alternative model that leans towards a dimensional view. Right.
You're right on the money. This alternative model focuses on how a person's sense of self and their interpersonal functioning are disrupted.
Yeah.
So instead of slotting someone neatly into a category, it looks at the severity of their impairments on a continuum.
It's fascinating how even within the field, there's this ongoing discussion about the best way to understand these disorders. It makes you wonder what the future holds for diagnosis and treatment.
Absolutely. This is a dynamic field, and how we conceptualize personality disorders is constantly evolving.
For now, let's dive into the 3 clusters the DSM uses.
Okay.
Seem like a good starting point for understanding the different ways these disorders can manifest.
You got it. Cluster A is often described as the odd or eccentric cluster. It includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. People with these disorders often have difficulty relating to others and may exhibit unusual or eccentric behaviors.
Okay, so cluster A is about being withdrawn and suspicious. What about cluster B?
Cluster B is characterized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviors. This cluster includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. You'll often see patterns of impulsivity, intense emotions, and difficulty maintaining stable relationships.
So if cluster A is about being withdrawn, cluster B is about being over the top in a sense.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, cluster C is often called the anxious or fearful cluster. It includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. These folks tend to experience a lot of anxiety and fear, and they often try to manage these feelings through avoidance dependence on others or rigid routines and control.
To really get a sense of these disorders, let's dive into some of those case studies the chapter uses. They really bring these diagnoses to life.
Absolutely. Starting with schizoid personality disorder, we have the case of Mr. Z, the brilliant physicist who chose to live a solitary life in Antarctica.
He was so absorbed in his research that he actively avoided any social interaction. The chapter mentions he even preferred playing chess against a computer rather than with another person.
Mr. Z really exemplifies that core feature of schizoid personality disorder, a profound detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression.
Yeah.
He seemed content, even happy in his isolated world.
It's almost like he found a way to eliminate all the things that most of us crave: connection, intimacy, belonging. But that's the point, right? For someone with schizoid personality disorder, those things just aren't motivating.
And while Mr. Z might be an extreme example, it highlights the very real struggle people with this disorder face. It's not just about being a loner, it's about a fundamental lack of interest in social connection.
Now let's shift gears to antisocial personality disorder, which is often portrayed in movies and TV shows. The chapter presents the case of Ryan, whose life was marked by deceit, manipulation, and a total disregard for the rights of others.
Right. Ryan was constantly in trouble with the law. He was stealing, conning people, even showing aggression towards animals from a young age. And the thing is, he never seemed to feel any remorse for his actions.
This lack of remorse, combined with a pattern of impulsivity, disregard for rules, and a willingness to exploit others, is a classic presentation of antisocial personality disorder.
Right.
It's important to note that not everyone with this disorder will engage in criminal behavior, but the underlying personality traits are often present. The chapter also delves into the concept of psychopathy, which seems very similar to antisocial personality disorder. Is there a clear distinction between the two?
That's a question that has puzzled researchers for decades. Some argue that psychopathy is a more severe form of antisocial personality disorder, emphasizing personality traits like glibness, superficial charm, and a grandiose sense of self-worth.
So while someone with antisocial personality disorder might lie and cheat to get what they want, a psychopath might be much more calculated and manipulative in their approach.
Exactly. They might be able to charm their way into positions of power or manipulate others with ease, all while lacking any genuine empathy or remorse.
This raises an interesting question. Could some seemingly successful people in society actually be psychopaths just really good at hiding it?
That's a thought-provoking question, and it's certainly a topic that's been explored in popular culture and even in some research. The idea that someone could be ruthless and manipulative enough to climb the corporate ladder, for example, but be so charming and charismatic that no one suspects their true nature, it's a chilling thought.
It definitely makes you wonder. The chapter mentions some research on potential genetic and neurological influences on antisocial personality disorder. What are some of the key findings there?
Research suggests that people with antisocial personality disorder might have differences in their brain structure and function, particularly in areas related to emotional processing and impulse control. For example, studies have shown that they may have an underactive amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing fear and anxiety.
So they don't experience fear or anxiety in the same way that most people do.
Exactly. This could explain why they engage in risky or dangerous behavior without feeling the same level of apprehension. There's also research suggesting that they may have a heightened reward system, meaning they're more driven by the pursuit of pleasure and less deterred by potential consequences.
So it's like a double whammy: less fear of punishment and a stronger drive for reward. That's a potent combination that can lead to impulsive and even destructive behavior.
And when you factor in environmental influences like childhood trauma or neglect, the picture becomes even more complex.
That makes sense. It seems like both nature and nurture play a significant role in the development of antisocial personality disorder.
Right. It's never just one thing. It's a complex interplay of factors. Now let's move on to a disorder that's often misunderstood and misrepresented: borderline personality disorder.
This one seems to be particularly challenging because it involves such intense emotions and unstable relationships.
Absolutely. The chapter uses the case of Claire to illustrate the hallmark features of this disorder. Claire struggled with chronic feelings of emptiness, intense anger, and a terrifying fear of abandonment. Her relationships were chaotic, and she often engaged in self-harm to cope with her emotional pain.
It sounds incredibly painful to experience the world in such an intense and unpredictable way. The chapter mentions this term, emotional dysregulation, as being central to borderline personality disorder. Can you explain what that means?
Emotional dysregulation is essentially the inability to manage and regulate emotions effectively. People with borderline personality disorder experience emotions very intensely, and these emotions can shift rapidly and unpredictably.
So they might go from feeling happy and loved to feeling utterly abandoned and rejected in a matter of minutes.
Exactly. And because they lack the skills to cope with these intense emotions, they might engage in impulsive or self-destructive behaviors like substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, or self-harm as a way to manage their emotional pain.
It's almost like their emotions are a roller coaster they can't get off of.
Yeah.
The chapter also highlights the tragic link between borderline personality disorder, and suicide.
Yes, unfortunately, people with borderline personality disorder are at a significantly higher risk for suicide than the general population. Their intense emotional pain, impulsivity, and feelings of hopelessness can make them particularly vulnerable.
And it seems like there's a strong connection between borderline personality disorder and trauma, particularly childhood trauma.
Research consistently shows that people with borderline personality disorder are more likely to have experienced childhood trauma, such as physical or sexual abuse, neglect, or witnessing violence. These early experiences can have a profound impact on emotional development and can contribute to the development of this disorder.
So it's not just about having a difficult personality. It's about understanding the underlying pain and trauma that might be driving these behaviors.
Exactly. And that's why empathy and compassion are so crucial when interacting with someone who has borderline personality disorder.
Before we move on, is there anything else we should know about Cluster B personality disorders?
Oh, we've got one more to cover in this cluster. Narcissistic personality disorder. And I think Willie, the case study from the chapter, perfectly captures the essence of this disorder.
Willie, the office worker who believed everyone was his staff.
That's the one. He had this inflated sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for others. He truly believed he was superior to everyone around him.
This grandiosity and need for admiration seem to be the defining features of narcissistic personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But what drives this behavior? Is it just arrogance, or is there something more going on beneath the surface?
That's a great question. The chapter mentions a few possible explanations. One theory suggests that people with narcissistic personality disorder may have experienced neglect or emotional abuse in childhood, leading them to develop a fragile sense of self that they constantly need to bolster through external validation.
So it's like they're trying to compensate for a deep-seated insecurity by creating this image of themselves as being perfect and superior.
Exactly. Another theory focuses on a lack of empathy. It suggests that people with narcissistic personality disorder never fully develop the ability to understand and share the feelings of others.
So they're so focused on their own needs and desires that they simply can't see beyond themselves.
Precisely. They lack the capacity to truly connect with others on an emotional level, and this can lead to exploitative and manipulative behavior.
Before we move on to Cluster C, there's something I found particularly interesting in the chapter. The suggestion that some serial killers might actually fit the profile of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
That's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that a seemingly benign trait, like a need for order and control, could, in extreme cases, manifest in such a dark and dangerous way.
It's a reminder that personality is a complex and multifaceted thing, and even traits that we generally consider positive can have a dark side when taken to extremes.
Right.
So listener, what's resonating with you so far? We've explored some pretty intense territory, but it's all part of understanding the complexities of the human personality.
Right.
Next up, we'll delve into the anxious and fearful cluster. So get ready to unpack avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. All right, let's explore Cluster C, where anxiety and fear really take center stage. We're talking about those personality disorders that are marked by a pervasive sense of unease and a deep-seated need to avoid anything that might trigger those feelings.
Yeah.
This cluster includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders.
You got it. And each one tackles that anxiety in a different way. First up is avoidant personality disorder.
Okay.
Imagine wanting connection, longing for close relationships, but being so terrified of rejection that you isolate yourself.
It's like standing outside a party you really want to go to, but being too scared to walk through the door.
That's a perfect analogy. The chapter introduces us to Jane, a woman who embodies this struggle.
Right.
She was convinced that people would judge her as inadequate, so she constantly anticipated rejection and criticism, even misinterpreting neutral interactions as signs of disapproval.
It's heartbreaking because that anxiety essentially became a self-fulfilling prophecy. She was so afraid of being rejected that she avoided social situations altogether, which in turn reinforced her belief that she was unlovable.
Exactly. And sadly, her early experiences with an abusive and critical mother only deepened those negative beliefs. The chapter highlights how those early childhood experiences, especially with caregivers, can have a lasting impact on our sense of self-worth and our ability to form secure attachments.
Yeah, it seems like a vicious cycle. The fear of rejection leads to avoidance, which then further strengthens the feeling of being unworthy.
Precisely. And while there's some research suggesting that genetics might play a role in avoidant personality disorder, those early childhood experiences seem to be a key factor.
So nature and nurture both at play, just like with the other disorders we discussed.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears to dependent personality disorder, which is all about that overwhelming need for reassurance and support from others.
Okay.
The chapter tells the story of Karen, who stayed in an abusive marriage for years because she was terrified of being alone.
Oh, wow.
She couldn't make even simple decisions without seeking her husband's approval and lived in constant fear of being abandoned.
It's like she surrendered her entire sense of self to this relationship, even though it was clearly harmful.
That's a common pattern with dependent personality disorder.
Yeah.
There's this deep-seated belief that they're incapable of taking care of themselves, so they cling to others for guidance and support, even if those relationships become toxic.
And like with avoidant personality disorder, early experiences, particularly with caregivers, can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. Early loss of a caregiver, whether through death, separation, or neglect, can create this profound fear of abandonment that persists into adulthood. It's like they're always seeking that sense of security they never received as children.
They're trying to fill that void, but they're looking for it in the wrong places.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. Now let's move on to obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And it's important to clarify that this is not the same as OCD, the anxiety disorder.
Right. I remember the chapter making that distinction. It's about a rigid personality style,
Yeah.
not about intrusive thoughts and compulsions.
Exactly. People with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder are fixated on orderliness, perfectionism, and control.
Right.
They have this deep-seated need to do things the right way, and they can become so preoccupied with details that they lose sight of the bigger picture.
The chapter uses the case of Daniel, who was so obsessed with perfecting his dissertation that he was years behind schedule.
Yeah.
His marriage was falling apart and his career was on hold, all because he couldn't let go of his need for control.
Yeah.
It's ironic, isn't it? Their desire for control ultimately leads to a loss of control over their lives.
Exactly. Their rigidity and perfectionism become so all-consuming that they struggle to maintain healthy relationships, enjoy their work, or even just relax.
And like with the other personality disorders, both genetic and environmental factors seem to be involved.
Right. Some researchers believe that genetics might predispose some individuals to obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. But early experiences such as overly controlling or critical parenting can also play a role.
So imagine growing up in an environment where everything has to be just so, where mistakes are met with harsh criticism. It's not surprising that those early experiences could shape a personality that's fixated on control.
That makes sense. It's like they're trying to create order in their lives to compensate for the chaos they might have experienced in their childhoods.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground, but I have to ask, what are the chances of successful treatment for personality disorders? They seem so deeply ingrained. Can therapy really make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's not an easy one to answer.
Right.
The success of treatment really depends on a lot of factors: the specific disorder, the individual's motivation, the therapeutic approach used. But one thing is clear: early intervention is key.
So catching those problematic patterns in childhood before they become entrenched.
Exactly. Imagine you're trying to bend a tree.
Right.
It's much easier to shape it when it's young and flexible.
Yep.
But once that tree matures, it becomes much harder to change its course. It's the same with personality. The earlier we intervene, the better the chances of redirecting those maladaptive patterns.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
But what about adults who are already struggling with personality disorders? Is there hope for them?
Absolutely. There are several effective therapies like dialectical behavior therapy, DBT for borderline personality disorder, that have shown promising results in helping people manage their symptoms and improve their quality of life.
But it's crucial to remember that therapy is a journey, often a long and challenging one. And the first hurdle is often getting the individual to recognize that they have a problem in the first place.
Right, that lack of insight we talked about earlier. It's tough because often the person doesn't see their behavior as being the issue.
Right.
They might blame others for their difficulties or simply not understand why they're struggling.
It's a reminder that understanding personality disorders requires empathy and compassion, not just judgment. These are real people struggling with deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and behaving, and they deserve our support and understanding.
I couldn't agree more. So, listener, as we wrap up our discussion of Cluster C, think about how anxiety and fear can manifest in different ways.
Right.
Some people withdraw, others become dependent, and some try to control their world to manage their unease.
It's all about finding ways to cope, even if those coping mechanisms ultimately become problematic.
Exactly. And that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It's about understanding the human struggle to find peace and security in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable. So we've explored all three clusters of personality disorders, from the odd and eccentric to the dramatic and emotional to the anxious and fearful.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through the complexities of the human psyche.
It really makes you think about how we define normal when it comes to personality. Where do we draw the line between a unique personality quirk and a disorder that needs professional attention?
Yeah, that's a question that has challenged psychologists and researchers for decades.
Right.
And it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer.
Right, because personality exists on a spectrum. We all have our own unique traits and tendencies, and what might be considered eccentric in one context could be perfectly acceptable in another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that not everyone who exhibits some of these traits has a personality disorder. A diagnosis requires a specific set of criteria to be met, including significant distress or impairment in functioning.
Right.
So just because someone is a bit of a perfectionist doesn't mean they have obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or just because someone is shy and withdrawn doesn't mean they have avoidant personality disorder.
Precisely. It's about the severity and pervasiveness of these traits and how they impact the person's life and relationships.
Speaking of impact, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you encounter about personality disorders?
One of the most common misconceptions is that people with personality disorders are just difficult or manipulative, and that they can change if they simply try harder.
Yeah, it's like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off.
Yeah.
These disorders are complex and often deeply rooted in a person's biology and early life experiences.
Right.
It's not a matter of willpower or choosing to be different.
Mm-hmm.
These patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving are ingrained, and they often require professional help to address.
Another misconception is that people with personality disorders are dangerous or violent. While it's true that some disorders, like antisocial personality disorder, can involve harmful behaviors, it's important to remember that not everyone with a personality disorder fits that stereotype.
Right, it's about seeing the individual, not just the label.
Exactly, and that leads to another important point. Treatment is not a one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another, and it often involves a combination of therapy, medication, and support from loved ones.
And sometimes it's more about harm reduction than a complete cure, right?
Absolutely. For some disorders, the focus might be on managing symptoms, improving coping mechanisms, and enhancing the person's quality of life.
The chapter touched on the idea that some personality disorders might actually become less severe with age. Is there any truth to that?
There's some evidence to suggest that certain disorders like antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder might become less intense as individuals get older, but again, it's not a guaranteed outcome.
So it's not like turning 40 magically erases all the problems.
I wish it were that simple. It's more about individuals learning to navigate the world differently, developing more adaptive coping strategies, and hopefully finding a greater sense of stability over time.
That makes sense. It's about growth and evolution, not a sudden transformation.
Precisely. So, listener, why should you care about understanding personality disorders? Why is this topic relevant to your life?
Yeah, that's a good question.
For starters, it can help you better understand yourself and the people around you. Maybe you recognize some of these patterns in your own behavior, or you see them in a friend, family member, or colleague.
Having that aha moment of recognition can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. It can lead to seeking help, offering support, or simply having more empathy and patience in your relationships.
And on a broader level, understanding personality disorders helps us appreciate the incredible diversity of the human experience.
It reminds us that there's no single normal way to be, and that even those who might seem different or difficult are struggling with their own unique challenges. It's about fostering compassion and understanding, both for ourselves and for others.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of personality disorders. It's a complex and fascinating field, and I hope this episode has given you a new perspective on the human personality. Remember, these disorders exist on a spectrum, and there's a world of difference between having a few quirky traits and meeting the criteria for a full-blown diagnosis. If you're interested in learning more, there are tons of great resources available online and in libraries, and hey, maybe even consider picking up that psychology textbook you gave us. You never know what fascinating insights you might uncover.